refer to as Rococo silhouettes, which are being featured on the right-hand side of the screen. So think Marie Antoinette, sort of tall hair, powdered wigs, that sort of silhouette. That is at odds with the silhouette on the left-hand side of the screen, which, just to sort of sum up very quickly, is very simple, is much more natural. And that shift between the more natural and simple styles and the more artificial styles of the Rococo, that's actually a shift that happens pretty quickly. And then one of the major reasons for that shift to simplicity is this sort of renewed fascination in the classical Greek and Roman world. So now to this discussion of neoclassicism in dress that we're going to kind of spend a lot of time talking about this evening. So the ancient cities, the ancient Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were unearthed in the mid-18th century. And at this point, after that point, right, Europe was just captivated. And a classical revival began affecting architecture almost immediately. Architecture in terms of building, but also like furniture and home furnishings. And then it also started to influence paintings a few years later. It took a little while longer to find its way into fashion, but it certainly did. And so, this kind of all comes to a head under Napoleon, who was equally fascinated by all of these discoveries and sort of also threw into the mix some of the aesthetics that he'd seen during his campaigns in Egypt. So during the late 18th and early 19th century, so, fast forward again, people's understanding of classical dress was based on what they were seeing in these archaeological digs of these ancient cities. So they were using the evidence that they encountered. And so they were looking at these statues, which originally would have been very garishly colored, very much painted, but that paint having long since worn off after exposure to the elements. They were looking at pottery. This is actually, this Kylix from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a fairly rare, it's more of a rare example where we do get a little bit of color. Greek pottery that we often encounter is this orangish red, black sort of combination where you don't get a lot of detail about color. And we know now from contemporary written sources in the Greek and Roman world that they loved color. So, we don't always see that in the neoclassical dress of this early 19th century, which I'm showing you some examples of here. So we could look at these fashion illustrations, the garments that these women are wearing and say, oh, well, this is not actually what the Greeks were wearing, but, the Greeks or the Romans were wearing. But, I don't think complete fidelity was ever the aim. And I don't think in any fashion revival, whether it be in the early 19th century or now in 2021, that's not the aim, right? We view whatever period we're reviving through our contemporary lens, and we cherry pick what's going to work, we cherry pick what we want, and sort of incorporate that into this new meaning and messaging that clothing is giving off. So I wanted to go back to this slide for a moment and just point out a couple of details that'll kind of come up over and over again in our conversation this evening. And so again, in that Kylix on the left-hand side of the screen, what you see around her shoulders is, we would call it a shawl. The Greek term for it is himation or himation. And it was made out of wool, but it was a garment that was worn by both men and women, actually. But it was very ubiquitous during this time period. But if we look on the right-hand side of the screen, I think we encounter in the taller figure, in the older figure, the kind of most identifiably sort of classical and then eventually neoclassical silhouette, which is this raised waistline. So you can see the sash around right underneath her bust line is been raised above that natural waist. And so there's really a diminishing of the natural curves of a woman's body, so the bust, waist, and hips, in an effort to emphasize verticality and an effort to emphasize a similarity with columns, and the way that fabric of her dress is draped around her body, it has that sort of connection to the flutes on a column. And so there's a real close proximity in this classical period between art, architecture, and all of those visual fields, which is really fascinating to think about. So if we go back to this image, now you have a little bit of more grounding, a little bit more foundation into which to understand what you're seeing. And so if we look at the fashion plate on the far left-hand side of the screen, we see that shawl or that himation. And just to drive the point home, we're reviving those classical styles. You can see the Greek key motif or the meander pattern, which is the sort of, so there's the red shawl, and then the meander pattern is the almost wave-like looking geometric pattern on either, sort of border of it. You're probably familiar with this, but I wanted to just point that out. So they've included that in this sort of already Greek-inspired, shawl, just to sort of like drive home the point specifically. We could talk about the women's hairstyles, and I'm looking particularly at the image in the center of the screen, being very Greek and Roman inspired. But then again, what's bearing out from the slide we saw before into the dress from this museum in Norway is that empire or empire waist, which is creating that, or I guess de-emphasizing the waist and creating that sort of length and verticality and connecting them back to the classic art and architecture, and in both, the sense of dress and how, the columns that they were, seeing in their life. So now back to our paintings. So here we see again, 25-year-old Henrietta Teackle. And she's displaying two of the elements that we've just spoken about in terms of neoclassical dress. The shawl, which is sort of draped around the back of her. It's this sort of pinkish red, piece of fabric that she's got draped around, offering a little bit of color. Oftentimes these shawls were the pop of color in an otherwise neutral silhouette and an otherwise neutral ensemble. And we're also seeing the raised waistline that's, sort of elongating her figure. She's got this lovely, pretty low cut. She's not married yet, so that's a little bit more acceptable to show off that much of the décolletage. But she's got this fairly low cut neckline, this high waistline, and this lovely draped fabric. So what I want to focus on specifically for this image is color, or I guess you might say the lack thereof. So there's a book that's recently been published by an author whose name is Amelia Rouser, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book called The Age of Undress. And in it, she states that neoclassical dress was overwhelmingly and distinctively white. I would add to this, to Rouser's description of these neoclassical dresses, that they were also overwhelmingly created from a fabric called cotton muslin. So if you have had any experience with fabrics, this is about cotton muslin of this period is about as far away as you can imagine to our cotton muslins that you might encounter today. You can go to Joann's Fabrics and buy cotton muslin for, under $10 a yarn. And it's this sort of coarse, not very tightly woven fabric that you use just to sort of mock things up and sort of use as prototypes. Nothing like the cotton muslin that Henrietta Teackle is wearing in this portrait is being produced today. And it actually, that exact type of muslin can't be produced today because there are no known seeds of the species of cotton that was used to create this muslin. It does not survive anymore. So this cotton muslin was woven in India. And so specifically, it was woven in Dhaka, which is actually a city in Bangladesh now, but at the time it was in India. And it was a very rare, even then, a rare variety of cotton that only grew along the banks of one of the tributaries of the Ganges River. It was imported to Europe by the British East India Company, and people were mad to get a hold of this. I mean, it was the must-have fabric of the moment because it was going to drape beautifully and allow you in these empire waisted gowns to really get that very classical look. So the tradition of weaving in Dhaka was, can be dated back to the 4th century, and it was created. The weaving of muslin was created in a very complicated 16-step process. So it was the men who were doing the weaving, and you can see the man at the loom. It was specifically a pit loom that he's sitting at on the left-hand side of the screen. There is the now extinct species of cotton in the center, and then part of the process of processing this cotton that was used for this muslin. So this was, by all accounts that I've read, an incredibly finicky fiber. It was best to weave this fabric in the rainy season, or at least if you couldn't do that, when the air was damp, so early morning, late afternoon, because otherwise the brittle fabrics would break or snap. It needed the humidity. And it also needed this humidity because the staple fibers of cotton are very short, and this humidity allowed them just a little bit of stretch, just a little bit of give, and made them a little bit more easy to work with. According to author Sonia Ashmore, who has written a fantastic book about muslin, it took 2 men 10 to 30 days to weave a single length. And at that time, what a length meant was 20 yards by 1 yard. And finer, still examples of muslin might take up to 6 months. So this was an extraordinarily labor-intensive process. And the results of, the resulting fabric was incredibly expensive. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of like how expensive it was, silk is, for most of history, silk was the most expensive textile, fabrics woven from silk. And in comparing it to cotton muslin, the best silk at this time was 26 times less expensive than cotton muslin. And, I guess it's maybe worth noting that, of course, the guy who's weaving it, the ladies who were spinning it, not paid very well at all, and working under really kind of harsh conditions. The other thing about this cotton muslin is that it's pretty darn transparent, right? So most of the the tradition of weaving and making making cotton, cottons in India is still something that's happening. And so in modern times, the cottons that are coming out of these areas of now Bangladesh, they have a thread count of between 40 and 80. So think about sheets, if you're thinking about thread count of sheets, oftentimes like the higher the thread count, the more expensive, and also the nicer quality it is. So modern day, the cottons coming out of this area of the world have about a 40 to an 80 thread count. Back in the day when Henrietta and Esther were wearing this cotton muslin, those had thread counts ranging in the sort of world of 800 to 1200. So significantly finer, significantly. I've never held this in my hand. I've never had a chance to have my hands on it, but I can't imagine, it must be just like air. It must just be gorgeous. So one of the reasons I'm pairing these two images is that, one, to talk about the muslin, but also I was very struck by how similar the silhouettes are. In the Jacques-Louis David portrait, you have a very similar neckline, a very similar crossing of the fabric. The sleeves, besides the little tassels that are hanging, are very, very similar. Of course, we have a little bit more modesty here with Henrietta, a few more layers of that muslin, making it slightly slightly more opaque in certain areas. But they used this transparency of the muslin to their advantage. Rausser speaks about how that they would cover, areas of their body with this semi-transparent muslin to make their skin look even wider. So that continuation of the connection to the classical world was made. They were looking even more statuesque. They were looking even more marble-like by sort of draping this lovely film over their bodies and getting that look. So, white was at the time when Henrietta was wearing this fabric, when our young woman was wearing this fabric, white was looked on as, sort of a symbol of health, enlightenment, and certainly beauty. So with the fine transparent quality of muslins, and Esther's muslin is a little bit more opaque here, people need some way to keep warm. It wasn't that these were just dresses worn in the spring. These were dresses worn year round. And so, we see, if we go back to this image, both of them have their shawls. And that's one of the outerwear options, probably the most popular of the outerwear options during this neoclassical era. But we turn to Esther because it is her shawl that's particularly fascinating to look at and to think about. So I had to keep doing the math here because when I first calculated that she was only 15 years old in this image, I kept thinking, I've done something wrong, I've done something wrong. But she looks quite lovely in this image, and certainly is wearing, if you take into consideration the cost of her muslin, and then as we'll speak about in a moment, the cost of the shawl she's wearing, she's dressed very richly, very well. And so, this shawl is another example of one of these classically inspired pieces that was achieved with goods that originated again in India. So if you look at fashion plates of the period, if you look at the sheer amount of shawls in museum collections, I've lost count of how many of these shawls we have in our collection. I will suffice it to say we have too many for the space that we have. But it seems like no lady left her house without one of these shawls, and they were just everywhere. And so the illustration on the left-hand side of the screen from the ladies' magazine, in the caption of it goes into great detail about, what's being seen, how it's connected to the classical world. You're seeing that sort of empire waistline, column-like looks, the sort of balustrade in the back emphasizing that. But they're very specific, they're very sort of make a point to identify the shawl that she's wearing and speak about it as a Persian scarf shawl. What they're basically describing is a cashmere shawl. And so this is the shawl you see around her shoulders that is that pop of color in an otherwise neutral field that's got some decoration on the border of it that she's using for potentially warmth. Certainly there is potential for some modesty there, depending on how low cut and how high your waistline is. But then I think it's also certainly a symbol of status and wealth for these ladies, especially if you have a genuine, honest to goodness, real shawl that came from cashmere. Even if, saying this term today and thinking about cashmere fiber today, there's immediately something that you think of when, in terms of quality, in terms of the cost you would pay for something that's made out of cashmere. So it's something that we're familiar with. A connection often gets made between Napoleon and cashmere, or maybe we should more accurately say Napoleon's first wife, Josephine. It's true. There's truth to the fact that Napoleon brought Josephine some cashmere shawls after his Egyptian campaign. And she started incorporating them, adapting them, adopting them into her dress around 1804. At one point, she owned 60 of these shawls, which would have been worth a large fortune, in fact. So you see her here in this portrait by Gros. And she's not only wearing this red draped cashmere shawl around her shoulders, which is sort of beautifully trailing on the floor behind her, but she's got this sort of draped overdress that's also made out of cashmere fabric. And this really points to the origins of the Persian word shawl. So this is SHAAL. And that's where our word shawl derives from. And that Persian shawl originally described not only just the shoulder mantle, but the fine woolen cloth itself, and was used in many different sort of configurations. Interestingly, when this shawl, which is I saw described in one of the books that I was reading about, these shawls being sort of like older than the hills, that they didn't just start being produced during this time period. They had been produced in cashmere for centuries. But it was a garment that was worn more by men than women, whereas when it came to Europe, it was worn more by women. And they made their way into Europe in this sort of early 19th century, again, from agents in the British East India Company. They weren't importing them to sell them because tariffs on them were so high. It was sort of like didn't make a lot of sense to do that. So women early on got a hold of these shawls by just, somebody they knew bringing over like 20 of them back and then reselling them as a result of that. So that's how they came to be in Europe. And in fact, they showed up before Napoleon gave his gifts of them to Josephine. And you can see this in the amazing painting by Jacques-Louis David from 1790, when these shawls started showing up. So this is just to show you where in the world, right? I think we're all familiar, but sometimes it's really helpful for me to sort of like, okay, where's this on the map? So Kashmir is, of course, a region that is today very politically in turmoil, but it has this rich tradition of textiles. And you're seeing another fashion plate here with a dress that's made out of one of these shawls. So there are two different fibers that were utilized in the creation of what were referred to as cashmere shawls. The two types of fibers are pasham and tus. So pasham comes from pashmina goats, which you're seeing those cute little critters on the left-hand side of the screen. And sometimes they're just referred to as shawl goats. And in Persian, that word pasham just means soft hair. Tus, on the other hand, comes from the Tibetan antelope, and you're seeing his very majestic stance on the right-hand side of the screen here. And the hair for the wool comes from the bellies of these Tibetan antelopes. And historically, the fiber from these Tibetan antelopes was reserved for the most exclusive people. These were the most expensive. These were the ones that if you had to visit some really important person, you'd bring that as a gift, as a sort of tribute, because of how valuable it was. Even now, even today, it's still regarded as one of the finest fibers, the finest fiber in the world. And in modern times, and unfortunately, the Tibetan antelope is highly endangered, and its trade is prohibited in most places around the world. And I kind of spent a lot of time reading a pamphlet that was put out by the US Fish and Wildlife Service that gave some pointers about distinguishing between the two fibers, the pasham and the tus. And so, how you can sort of visually determine which is different from the other. So I was reading this in part because I was, just curious. That's kind of what I'm into. But probably more so because I was on the hunt following this like discovery that I had made at the Textile and Costume collection. So in this collection that I curate, and you're seeing a piece here, I've been there for 5 years now. And I don't think it's an exaggeration for me to say that I've only seen a fraction of what we have. But I knew from a recent appraisal that we had a really old shawl. And so I was like, okay, I'm doing this presentation. We're getting out the old shawl. I want to check it out. So in the appraisal, it says, it describes this as a lovely example of what is called a ring shawl. And so we got this out, we unrolled it, and it is incredibly lightweight, particularly in comparison to a lot of the shawls that we'll talk about in just a moment and later on. And as we were preparing to photograph it, and you're seeing the photographs here, my colleague who was working with me, she said, is this silk? Because it's so lustrous, it's so fine, it's so lovely. And she can be forgiven for thinking that. But I said, no, I think it's cashmere. So of course, after we were done photographing, I Googled ring shawl, and that's what it's really referring to, is that this fabric is so fine, it's so delicate, so lovely, that its quality can be judged by if you can or can't pass it through a finger ring. And so that was one of its hallmarks of quality, and that's why it's referred to as a ring shawl. So, I think that this is that tusse fiber. I'd have to get my high-powered microscope out to really know it for sure, but it's fascinating to think that we have an example of, one of the finest fiber in the world. So there's no real way to know exactly if Esther's shawl is one of these tusse fiber shawls, or just, a regular cashmere shawl, which, still pretty nice. We need to be able to see a few more details of the fibers, and it's a lovely painting, but we don't have quite that many details. So just to speak about the production of cashmere shawls quickly, men are the ones who are doing the weaving of the shawls. And it was a very labor-intensive process that could take anywhere from 3 to 12 months, depending on the pattern. And, so if we were again to think about it compared to other shawls, so soon after these Kashmiri shawls began to be introduced into Europe, people were sort of like running to make imitations of them. So whereas an imitation European shawl could sell for around 20 to 25 pounds at the time, one that was genuinely from cashmere could run around 200 pounds. So very expensive. And so when women had these, they were, of course, lovely ornaments, but they were also very economically valuable. People would pass these down generation to generation. They were inherited, and they were frequently the most expensive, the most valuable piece in a woman's collection, in her woman's wardrobe. So this was something fascinating that I had to include. So I was reading a deportment manual. It was a French deportment manual, and it discouraged unmarried French women from wearing Kashmiri shawls because that would lead, quote, it would lead people to believe that they are possessed of an unbridled love of luxury and deprive themselves of the pleasure of receiving such finery from a husband, end quote. And so, although this was written a few decades after Esther sat for this painting, I just want to mention she did never marry. So it's also basically impossible, because of the level of detail that we have, to make out the motifs on Esther's shawl, like what exactly it is that we're seeing on there. So in India and Kashmir, the motif that we're seeing on this detail shot of the shawl from my collection, from the Textile and Costume collection, was referred to as the butta or bota, which literally translates to flower. And the Kashmiri shawl was the principal medium by which this now very, recognizable motif came to be popularized. And you're seeing this sort of chronological progression of it here in this illustration. I've alternatively heard it described as a teardrop shape, but it came to be called the name you're probably more familiar with, which is Paisley, which is after the Scottish town of the same name that began creating imitation shawls in 1805. Now, these imitation shawls had actually started again earlier, probably sometime around 1777, and British towns were just beside themselves trying to sort of beat the other towns just to the punch to sort of get this product that was so in demand that every woman wanted to have in her wardrobe. But it was really that town Paisley that came out on top, that they were the most successful with their production of shawls, and so much so that we call these Paisley shawls now after them. So they were most successful in large part because of the weaving technology that they were using. They had, after the jacquard loom was invented in 1801, they really started to incorporate the use of that advanced technology into their creation. Interestingly, one thing they couldn't imitate is the fiber. So they tried to import some of these shawl goats to Europe, and they just didn't produce the same type of fiber. The climate was different, their diets were different, so they didn't produce as fine of examples of wool. And so these paisley shawls, or these European shawls, because they were produced all over, are usually wool and silk. So genuine cashmere shawls, as I'm looking in my collection, and thinking which is which, genuine cashmere shawls can be distinguished from European imitations by studying the weaving techniques, which usually manifests on the back of the textile. And that's what you're seeing in the lower right-hand image there. That's the back side, which is showing clear details that indicate that was a jacquard woven instead of a hand loomed or hand embroidered piece, which is more the case of what we're seeing in this detail that you're seeing of the back of this Tous shawl from our collection. So they are also distinguishable because the later shawls, and this is one of them, is heavier, and they have this all over pattern. So they're actually a lot more like carpets, in all honesty, than those earlier shawls. And so, if we didn't have a date for Henrietta's painting, one of the things that we could use to date it is the shawl, because that tells us the age. The all over pattern is going to indicate the later shawls, and this, where she has the pattern only on the ends and the borders, is really indicative of an earlier shawl. So I can probably very confidently say that this is a cashmere shawl. Which of the specific fibers it is, I would have a heck of a time sort of pinning that one down. But I do know that it's not an imitation one. So the beautiful thing about looking at these paintings, or any visual art, or just thinking about history in general, is how much can really be illuminated by the details, by looking at the details of dress. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, like I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop because I'd rather hear your questions. And so, I leave it as a challenge to you to consider, as you dive into these works of art, as you think about the details that you're seeing in front of you, don't discount what you can learn from a really close investigation of the details of the clothing. So thank you very much. You've got a few ways that you can stay in touch with me, and I'd love to hear any questions you have.
Well, I want to just start, before Hildy poses questions from others. And I just want to say that I found this totally and completely fascinating. I had no concept of the value of cotton muslin and everything that it represents. And the discussion of Henrietta's shawl is really quite fascinating to me. I didn't know that Henrietta had her own inheritance, and that really, and again, I don't know where that information comes from. I didn't have it, but that changes the way I see her historically. I always had believed her father died. She moved to Philadelphia to live with her sister because she had no means of her own, and that changes it. And also the fact of the luxury of what she's wearing and the way that it's painted. And here's where I thought I might be able to add something here.
Please.
I've looked at the pattern on the edge of that shawl quite a bit, and I've really marveled how the young Thomas Sully, and this is Thomas Sully, has just arrived in the United States. Nobody knows who he is. He is a daring choice as the portraitist here. He's not established at all. He's been working with Benjamin West in London, and he comes to the United States. And this is an early this is an early Thomas Sully portrait. And you can, if you're actually looking at the paint quality of the pattern on the edge of the shawl, it's as if it's deliberately indistinctly made, that you try to see the pattern come into focus and you can't. And the way he paints it, it almost looks like he uses the back end of the paintbrush and scrapes into the paint to create the pattern. And when you were describing the incredible luxury of this, there's always been something in the back of my mind about this particular portrait that reminded me of the Italian Renaissance, and particularly the Mannerists, Parmigianino and the Madonna of the long neck, or those dramatic Bronzino portraits of, the courtiers of, the Medici court of Duke Cosimo and Eleonora. And she has that aloofness, that marble kind of statuesque quality. And the way that she's wearing this shawl, I mean, if we establish that this shawl is an object of extraordinary luxury, she's wearing it in a way that really establishes her social status as an aristocrat. Because if you think about these Bronzino portraits and these Renaissance portraits, and you think about the ideal that these people were aspiring to, which is codified for us, handed down through generations in the book, The Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. And, the most important quality of a courtier is nonchalance.
Yes.
It's you wear rich things, but if you're at a picnic, you just sit in the grass because you can get another one. And or so she's wearing this shawl of high luxury as if, oh, it's nothing, I don't even have to show it off. You want to see what it is? Well, I'm concealing that from you. There's something, I mean, I started out by saying I always found these portraits mysterious. I now find I really do feel like I understand that it's not a passive quality of mystery, that it's actually, and I think especially in the portrait of Henrietta, a mystery that is sort of deliberately created by what I'm showing you and what I'm not showing you. And she's really showing herself off there, right? I mean, she's beautifully painted, her flesh is gorgeous. And then the thing that's so luxurious, well, you just get little hints of, enough to know it's there, but enough to know that she doesn't have to show it off. It's, it's there, but no.
I love that.
It's so interesting. And I want to go back now to the book of The Courtier. I mean, I don't know how it passed down through the generations, but I know that it was translated into books of etiquette and people read it. I mean, and when you think of, the federal period of American art, and, the idea that, the new aristocracy of America is trying to define themselves, it makes sense that actually they'd be looking at, the book of The Courtier and, translations of that into the books of manners of their own time. And I'm really scratching my head about it, but incredibly curious. And I just feel, Jade, that you opened up so much about both of these portraits. I mean, I'm focusing on the Henrietta portrait, but I feel like I by knowing about by knowing what these garments actually mean, it opens up a whole new dimension to an understanding of, what this represents in terms of, self-identity and aspiration, but also, the aspirations of a class of people who are defining the new America.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's totally fascinating talk. And I just want to say thank you. But it gave me so much to think about.
Well,
So
thank you, Bill. And this is where my theater background and training comes in, because we are always stronger when we collaborate, right? When we have people of different expertise and different backgrounds come together, we get such a richer picture of whatever we have in front of us. So I always relish the opportunities to collaborate.
me too. You know, I always knew there was something that I wasn't understanding, and I feel like you, you know, opened that up for me. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Hildy, do we
Yeah.
have some questions?
We do. We have a few questions. I did first just want to tell you or share that, Bill, when we were researching the Teackle sister portraits and we had gone down to the Historical Society in Center City, that's where I found this information about Esther's inheritance.
Ah,
And it may have been because she was single, that her father left her this property and this, you know, a certain sum of money, as opposed to Henrietta, who was married very well, you know, married very, very well, you know, to Chauncey. I'm trying to remember, Elijah Chauncey,
yeah.
the founder of the Reading Railroad, among other things. So in any case, yes, we do have some questions. And Jade, fascinating as always. Last summer, it was wonderful. Jade and I walked through the Founders Gallery and she looked at Henrietta Teackle and we were talking and I said, well, she married such and such. And she said, well, she's not married in this portrait. And I said, well, how did you know that? And then we looked at the Charles Willson Peale portrait of Mrs. Tench, which Jade has told us all about her bonnet. Well, that's another talk that we hope to have. But she said, look at how her chest is covered. You know, there's a cloth that's tucked into her bodice. And I said, who knew? You know, who knew? In any case, so we have a question from Eileen. She wants to know, and I'm not sure, Eileen, I wrote it to you in the Q&A. She was wondering, is David's portrait in Washington, D.C. or in London? And I don't know which David portrait you're referencing, whether it's the portrait of Josephine or the portrait of a young woman in white.
The young woman, I'm sorry, Hildy, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
The young woman in white is in the National Portrait Gallery in DC. Yeah.
Yeah. So if that's the one that Eileen is wondering about, she's, as you know, Eileen, Jade, she wants to know, she's wondering, and maybe Bill, you can help us here. Is it possible that Rembrandt Peale saw this portrait on his first trip to London? I guess if it was in London in 1802, do you think it was the inspiration for Henrietta's portrait?
Well, Rembrandt Peale did study in London, and so it's entirely possible that 1798, and the portrait of Henrietta is what year?
It's 1805.
I would have to, I would just have to look up the dates, but I think that's a really good thought. And you know, my sense about Rembrandt Peale is that he's a very curious man. So I would think that if the painting was available to be seen, he would have sought it out and seen it.
Yeah. Okay, so another question is, Jade, could you speak a little bit about the sleeve design in both portraits?
Oh, well, you know, this is, if we go back to that sort of thinking of Marie Antoinette period, Rococo, and for centuries before then, ladies had covered most of their arms. And so this was kind of the first, you know, this late 18th century, early 19th century was the sort of one of the first moments where like all this flesh of the arm was being shown again. And it was again sort of back to this moment of classicism. And so it's, you know, a cap sleeve. It's sort of very tight, you know, lightly ruched in the center of the arm there in both of these illustrations. I think it looks like Henrietta's is maybe being, you know, that ruching, that gathering being held by like a button. In the portrait of a young woman in white, it looks like it might be knotted and then the tassels coming down, but showing this amount of skin, whether, you know, certainly in the arm, but in the décolletage in the chest area, but also there's plenty of satirical sort of images of like how see-through in other areas these dresses were, and they were quite a scandal, even in the, you know, considered quite a scandal in the time period. Most women were probably wearing layers underneath, like Henrietta is wearing here, but those crazy French ladies, Josephine, setting an example for a scandal.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Another question was wondering, Nancy's wondering, how durable are these cotton muslin fabrics?
They're pretty delicate. You know, again, light as air. They also, you know, so in addition to the touche shawls, the chanteuse shawls being like talked about being drawn through a ring, there's also, I've seen, you know, sort of comments about these muslins being drawn through a ring. But I think the thing, and this was sort of reiterated or sort of, I was reminded of this. I went to an online webinar of a collection in England, and they were showing some examples of what's known as white work embroidery. So it was white floss on a muslin, a cotton muslin ground. And what they were showing in some of the examples that they had in their collection was the mending. That, you know, when these were potentially damaged, that there was care taken to mend them, to extend their life, and maybe if the damage was, you know, particularly bad in one area, you put a little embroidered motif or, you know, a little rosette there or something like that. So there's certainly for all fabrics greater care, greater sort of a greater sense of we need to extend the lifetime of this instead of just going out and buying something new, because that might not be financially feasible at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, what you were talking about was so, I mean, you began the talk by talking about how details in fashion speaks to technology, speaks to trade, you know, speaks to colonization and so on. And it's so amazing to think about these Europeans also trying to import these antelopes so they could refabricate, but it all depends on climate and what they're eating. And it's fascinating. And to be honest, I did not ever think about neoclassicism in fashion. I mean, certainly this is a time period when many artists are turning and looking at ancient civilizations as well. And, but I never put it together. So this is so enlightening, Jade. It's fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, and just a note, it's something I didn't get a chance to talk about in my presentation, but Hildy mentioned the importation of the actual animals so that they could, you know, even go a step further with their imitations of these shawls. There was one story that I read where it was like, okay, they got these goats, they got 25 females, 25 males, but for some reason they put them on different ships, and one of the ships made it to Europe, but the other ship didn't make it to Europe. So you just had a whole bunch of like male goats, and then that was the end of that. So they didn't do a great job.
It's amazing. And the thread count, I mean, it's just astounding. I mean, it'd be amazing to see these in person, but
yeah, it's do you have if you have another question, I won't go on because I'd rather
I think there's one more question. Let me see if I just does the lack of a necklace indicate youth or something else?
Oh, that's a very good question. So it could, but then I also read that because of the expense of these shawls and the understood expense and value of them to the people walking around and encountering you in your daily life, that sometimes these shawls took the place of jewelry, that they were the feature, that they were the decoration, that they were a bit of the focal point. And as I mentioned, it was often those pieces that were the pop of color in this otherwise neutral silhouette. So I think in answer to the question, yes, it could be because they are young and it was not appropriate to wear a certain amount of jewels unless you were a married woman or a woman of a certain age. But that shawl was a bit of a stand-in for that in some regards.
And then there's a comment that I'm glad Eileen said this because I love this part too. She said, I loved your interpretation of Esther wearing a shawl and never getting married. So amusing.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of a stretch because that was like from a manual in like 1850 something. But I thought, those sentiments don't just come out of nowhere. So there might have been some historical sort of decades past grounding in that.
That's about it for questions, but I think, this was fascinating. And we hope to get you back in the fall to talk more. Jade provides enormous insight, and it's so much fun.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get to my bibliography here. So I mentioned a couple of books, and so I wanted to sort of throw those out there in case anybody was interested in further reading.
Maybe I'll take a screenshot of this so I can pass this around to all of our participants.
Don't show my students. It's not exactly MLA formatting, but
it's okay, Jade.
You get the gist.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you both, Bill and Hildy, and everybody who was here and participating tonight. It was really a pleasure to speak to you. And I hope to see you all again very soon.
You will. Thank you so much, Jade.
Take care.
Have a good night. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.